Welcome, everyone, to the latest installment of the Vent webinar series. I am Ben Reynolds, producer and host of our virtual presentations. Today, we'll explore Germany's wild Northeast. Did you know fully a third of Berlin's land area is occupied with forests, parks, lakes, and fields, with more than 30 formal nature reserves within the city limits? All this wildness goes on just a stone's throw from the great museums and architectural landmarks of the old imperial capital, which is now the leading city in Europe's largest and most influential democracy. Guiding us through the highlights of this relaxed tour is none other than Vent tour leader Rick Wright. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Ben.
For those who haven't yet traveled with Rick, I would like to share a bit about him. Rick Wright is a widely published author and sought after lecturer and field trip leader. A native of southeast Nebraska, Rick studied French, German, philosophy, and life sciences at the University of Nebraska before making a detour to Harvard Law School. He took the PhD in German languages and literature at Princeton University in 1990, then spent a dozen years as an academic holding successive appointments as assistant professor of German at the University of Illinois, reader in art and archaeology at Princeton University, and associate professor of medieval studies at Fordham University. But that's not all. Rick is an excellent birder and tour guide. Now, let's turn to Rick as he shares why Germany, birds and art in Berlin and Brandenburg, is a first rate destination for the birding traveler.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to EC you this afternoon. Some of you know I like birds. I also like birding. But what I really like is birders. I won't go quite so far as Will Rogers. I may have met a few birders I didn't like, but never have I encountered a birder who wasn't interesting. And never have I met one who wasn't interested. Interested not just in birds, after all, it's birding usually that brings us together in the first place, not just in birds, but in all kinds of pursuits and endeavors, natural, historical, and otherwise. Plants, butterflies, snakes, beetles, the night sky, photography, they're all, I suppose, more or less expected co-pastimes. We're always outdoors anyway, so why not look around a bit? The curiosity of birders, though, reaches far beyond that. Shivering at a stakeout for a rare bird, slowly surveying the driving loop at a national wildlife refuge, or just poking around one of my own local patches, I'm continually amazed by the vast range of non-ornithological expertise and experience at hand in our birding community. Nowhere, I think, is that variety more conspicuous than around the dinner table at the end of the day on a vent tour. The conversation always starts with a tight focus on birds, what we've seen, what we've missed, what we're hoping for tomorrow. But once the day's avian tally is complete and the appetizers have been served, we find ourselves seated next to cooks and enophiles, composers and performers, potters and painters and sculptors, writers and insatiable readers of just about anything ever published in any conceivable field. I've met people who volunteer their time and treasure as advocates for the homeless, people who devote themselves to hybridizing daylilies and iris, people who collect anything and everything you could possibly imagine. Often enough, we're even sharing the dinner table with a couple of good-natured people who may not find birds all that absorbing, but they're along anyway to spend time with a partner or a friend or a traveling companion. This fascinating breadth of ideas and interests is one of the great strengths in American birding, and I'm very proud to have been a part of Vent's pioneering efforts over the years to play to that strength. Vent's Birds, Nature, and Culture program comprises tours around the world that ensure a first-rate birding experience against the backdrop of landscapes equally rich in historical and cultural significance. These tours tackle the problem of an invidious choice by making that choice entirely unnecessary. There's no either or, there's no birds or culture. We do both, often at the very same sites and at the very same time. And because most of these tours use only a single hotel, some two, with no packing and unpacking and repacking, it's also possible to take a morning or an entire day off to explore on your own, then meet up with the rest of the group at a fine lunch or dinner to trade sightings and stories. Over the years, with the support of Victor Emmanuel, Barry Lyon, and the Vent office staff, I've developed a dozen itineraries on this model, most of them in Europe. These itineraries are based in Inverness, in Barcelona, in Oviedo, on Erlang, in Krakow, in Florence, in Venice, in Bari, in Dijon, in Arles, and in Brest. One of the longest running of these excursions, though, takes us to another of my favorite natural and historical landscapes, the North German Plain, where we base ourselves in Germany's capital city, Berlin. Now, Germany is not, or at least hasn't been, a destination much on the minds of most traveling birders, but it should be, and especially these eastern regions, where accidents of history and intentional hard work have combined to produce a landscape as welcoming to birds as it is to the culturally interested human visitor. Like some of you, I imagine my own first visit to Berlin antedates the disintegration of the Iron Curtain 35 years ago. Berlin, which we called West Berlin back then, was still a politically, geographically, socially, militarily isolated exclave 100 miles from the rest of West Germany. Crossing that checkpoint into the German Democratic Republic, into East Germany, was exciting and a little bit shiver-inducing. In the days of the Cold War, this counted as enemy territory, and the border inspection was not the perfunctory glance at a document and a quick look through the luggage racks that we were used to in the rest of Europe. This was serious. It was serious, and for a birder, it was eye-opening. Crossing the border into East Germany and traveling those 100 miles to Berlin revealed a landscape almost unparalleled anywhere else in the tidy and prosperous west of Europe. This was a landscape topographically unsuited to heavy industry and to an intensive agriculture alike. It was a landscape seemingly frozen in time by accidents of history, politics, and economy that had placed it on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. In spite of decades of efforts at industrialization and modernization, this was, as I saw it for the first time, an undeveloped landscape. Undeveloped in the best, the richest, the most promising sense of that word. This North German plain was scoured by the glaciers of the Pleistocene, which on each of their withdrawals left behind vast areas of sand, which formed the raw material for the dunes of the Baltic and North Sea shores. The glaciers lingered longest in the eastern portion of the plain. On their final retreat, some 15,000 years ago, they exposed a soggy landscape of low-lying grasslands, fens, and ponds, reaching from the upper Elbe River into modern Poland. It was essentially impossible to actually bird that stretch of East Germany leading to Berlin. But even from a train window, even back then, it was obvious that this was a birdie place. There were birds that I knew from the West only as migrants or as winter visitors, or not at all. Montagu's harriers, hoopoes, hooper swans, all at home in vast open spaces with no real equivalent in West Germany. Then and there, I promised myself that someday I would bird East Germany. That time came sooner than most of us thought when the Berlin Wall opened on that November night in 1989. Suddenly, two cities were one again, and two countries were negotiating the terms of reunification after more than 40 years of ideological opposition, mutual distrust, and occasional bursts of violence. The decision to move the capital of the new Germany back east, to Berlin, immediately shifted our perceptions of just what was where in Europe. I still find it disorienting to think of Poland and Czechia and Slovakia and Hungary and Croatia as Central European, which of course is what those areas were before 1945 and what they are again today. For birders, this eastward shift of gravity opened up great swaths of the European continent that had been off limits to the binocular-toting crowd for 4 decades. And I've now managed to bird most of the countries once within the ambit of Soviet oppression. But I keep coming back to Eastern Germany for the birds and for the cultural treasures that the money pouring in after reunification made accessible once again. This is the perfect place for a birds and art tour, a place where every visitor finds something or a lot of somethings to intrigue and delight. I said earlier that neither of our focuses, neither birds nor history or culture in all its manifestations, neither is enjoyed to the exclusion of the other on these tours. Every one of my colleagues involved in Vent's nature and culture program has stories of discovering an outstanding birding opportunity at an archaeological site, for example, or visiting a known wildlife hotspot and suddenly noting that there is a medieval barn or a Greek temple or an Etruscan cemetery on the grounds. What I'd like to do this afternoon is tell you about some of the many places in and around Berlin where that happens, where birding and culture come together. Not where those elements collide, but where each adds a new dimension to the experience of the other. We'll start where our tour starts. Half a mile from one of the most bombastic Wilhelmine monuments, the Victory Column, which was dedicated in 1873 to commemorate Prussian victories over Denmark, Austria, and France. It's a fascinating structure, topped by a golden figure of Nike. It's a landmark no matter where you find yourself in central Berlin. Many tour participants climb this column, which involves a narrow spiral staircase comprising 285 steps. This is one of those optional activities that your leader usually opts out of. It's always possible from the base of the column to walk along the Avenue of June 17th, which commemorates the 1953 uprising in East Berlin, but it's much more interesting for us to take the winding path through Berlin's largest park, the Tiergarten, the Garden of the Beasts. The Tiergarten is the largest of Berlin's 44 wildlife refuges. Its 520 wooded acres account for more than 15% of the city's formerly protected green space. 500 years ago, this splendid park was the hunting preserve of the Brandenburg princes. In the middle of the 18th century, Frederick the Great, who was fonder of flute recitals and French conversation than of boar hunts, opened this forest to the public. In the 1930s, Hitler and his henchmen moved the Victory Column to its current site in the center of the park, and they reconceived the forests and gardens as lavish landscaping for a sinister new complex of buildings in what they assumed would eventually be the capital of a Nazified Europe. They didn't get far with that scheme happily, but the Tiergarten suffered just as much as the rest of Berlin did in the final weeks of the Second World War. The Tiergarten was devastated, stripped of its trees, first by Russian bombing and then by Berlin residents in dire need of firewood. The adjacent Berlin Zoo, meanwhile, became a source of protein for Berliners and occupying soldiers, with grave effects on the populations of certain rare species, among them the European bison, commemorated in this memorial statue tucked away in a quiet corner of the Tiergarten. Today, though, the Tiergarten has been restored and revegetated, and it offers our groups a lovely green corridor for excursions to the Brandenburg Gate, the Parliament Building, and all the other historic localities in Berlin's historic center. We typically devote 2 mornings to concentrated birding as a group in the Tiergarten, but for most of us, the most memorable moments there are had on impromptu walks. The range of bird species that you encounter in the Tiergarten is surprisingly broad. As we stroll among the sculptures and through the gardens, we regularly encounter raptors, such as the Eurasian sparrowhawk, a small bird recalling our sharp-shinned hawk, or the common buzzard, the original buteo, with the bulk and habits of a red-tailed hawk. Overhead, we might see a common kestrel or a white-tailed eagle, a close relative of the bald eagle that, like our species, has undergone an impressive population increase over the past 30 years. But don't worry, if we don't see them right in the city, we count on them to be in attendance on flocks of cranes and waterfowl in the countryside. The most appealing of all the birds of prey here is the Eurasian goshawk. It is a common bird in Berlin. There are some 40 pairs nesting inside the city limits, but it's shy. This species, as some of you probably know, was resplit from the American goshawk a couple of months ago. The Tiergarten at our season is also a good spot to look for migrants, such as white wagtails, song thrushes, goldcrests and firecrests, and finches. The new trees planted after the war in the 1950s are now 60 feet tall, and Eurasian nuthatches, short-toed tree creepers, and green and great spotted woodpeckers creep and peck along the trunks and larger limbs. As in urban parks around the world, some of these birds have adapted to novel food sources. Inevitably, though, our wanderings through the Tiergarten take us to more somber sights as well. A search for gray herons and common kingfishers along the main canal might take us past the site where the body of Rosa Luxemburg was discovered in 1919. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, just around the corner from the Brandenburg Gate, is a deeply unsettling reminder of what a sophisticated and civilized people is capable of. Out of respect for those mourning these victims, we don't visit as a group, but it's easy enough to peel off at some point to pay our respects. Simpler, less monumental, the memorial to the Sinti and Roma peoples of Europe commemorates the hundreds of thousands murdered in Nazi death camps. With a shallow pond approached across an unevenly sloping pavement of flat stones, this memorial is a deliberately disorienting way into a shameful history of inhumanity. We tend to be there in the early evening when forest birds come to drink from the pool and sing, a moment of poignant incongruity that leaves no one unmoved. Berlin is full of smaller parks too, though, many of them surrounding fine buildings that house some of Europe's most important cultural institutions. In and immediately following the Second World War, many of Germany's artistic and intellectual treasures were dispersed. The effort to recover the books and paintings and sculptures and archival documents and return them to their original owners, public and private, has been conducted since 1957 by the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which now administers almost 20 museums in Berlin, along with the Berlin State Library. A number of the foundation's research institutes host scholars from all around the world. Of course, there are some of those artifacts that will never return to Berlin. Some of them were destroyed during the war. Others are still held as war trophies in Poland and Russia. But after 35 years of rebuilding structures, rebuilding collections, Berlin is once again a museum city virtually without equal. Two of the very best are on the square known as the Culture Forum, across the street from the Berlin Philharmonic. The State Painting Gallery is an amazing place, worth far more than the half of a day we generally squeeze it into. But again, this tour is structured so that you can always find time for a second visit on your own if you want. In addition to the famous masterpieces by Raphael, Caravaggio, Van Eyck, Titian, Botticelli, Vermeer, Rembrandt, Rubens, the National Gallery's 2025 exhibition calendar includes shows featuring fireworks through the ages, the photography of Nan Goldin, early modern painting from Ukraine, German surrealism, expressionist woodcuts from the Blue Rider. You get the idea. Next door is another of my favorite museums in the world, the Museum of Applied Arts. I first visited when the building was brand new and the square in front of it was a massive muddy pit, and now I go back every time I'm in Berlin. The major highlight here is the medieval collection, which includes the priceless treasure of the Dukes of Brunswick, 100 miles east of Berlin. The 82 objects, sacred and secular, that make up this treasure were notoriously at the heart of a series of lawsuits, beginning in 2008 and finally concluded in 2021, a story that stands for all the complexity involved in determining the rightful ownership of artworks that passed through Nazi hands in the 1930s and 1940s. The final disposition before the Supreme Courts of both Germany and the US was that this treasure belonged to the German state. The third architectural anchor of the Culture Forum is the home of the Berlin Philharmonic, The building is the work of Hans Scharoun, opened in 1963. Unfortunately, and it's like this every year, the Philharmonic season opens at the end of October after our tour has ended. But we still take a moment to walk across Herbert von Karajan Street to admire the famous golden roof, which more often than not has a black redstart perched on it. Both of Berlin's opera houses, the German Opera and the Comic Opera, keep the same inconvenient schedule. So we have to seek our musical delights elsewhere. Berlin is fundamentally a musical city, and it's a university town too. So those of us who are interested are usually able to find an appealing performance by one of the city's smaller ensembles, often in an unexpected space. Last year, we took the 20-minute ride to Charlottenburg Palace, the oldest and most extensive royal complex still standing in Berlin. For 300 years, this was home to the Brandenburg Elector princes, the Prussian kings, and the German emperors. We took our seats in the White Salon, where all those long ago nobles kept their finest table services, and we heard Mahler's Fourth Symphony, arranged for chamber orchestra and piano. The pianist was responsible for the sleigh bells. It all worked, musically and atmospherically, and we retired to a fine dinner across the street. Even when there's no musical novelty to be had, this palace and its grounds are a can't-miss sight for the visiting birder, too. The Baroque gardens are patrolled by wagtails and song thrushes, while the large trees in the forested areas host European nuthatches, firecrests, and the usual array of colorful tits and finches. Our autumn tour usually coincides with notable peaks in migration, and in many years we find hawfinches, bullfinches, or fieldfares passing overhead. Occasionally a small flock of tundra bean geese will pass over, or a white-tailed eagle will soar through. Geese, eagles, there's no shortage of those on our excursions out of the city. The countryside surrounding Berlin and the capital of Brandenburg-Potsdam is charming. It's covered with little villages afloat in a sea of farmland, forest, and wetlands, all of them full of birds. For our days inside the city of Berlin, we use public transit, which is fast, safe, and immaculate. And I should point out that on our first evening together, you're given a ticket good for the entire week on the trains and buses and subways, making spontaneous excursions very easy. For our group trips out into the countryside, we have a comfortable little bus and a driver, which takes us out to the area's big lakes in search of up to 6 or 7 species of geese, including tundra bean geese, gray-lag geese, greater white-fronted geese, and barnacle geese. We often encounter a bar-headed goose or a Canada goose in the big flocks, and pink-footed geese are becoming more frequent here too. All of those tasty waterfowl attract raptors. When I started birding in Germany 40 years ago, any eagle sighting was a big deal. Now, in Brandenburg in autumn, every big lake has a few, and on recent tours, we've seen as many as a dozen at a time, perched above the big flocks of geese and ducks, or chasing each other around on the banks. One of those places is Alt-Friedland, where fish ponds dug 700 years ago for the local Cistercian monastery are still in use, to the untold delight of herons and egrets, great cormorants, and common kingfishers. We bird here. Then we have lunch in the restaurant installed in one of the monastery buildings just behind the beautiful red brick Gothic ruin of the monastery scriptorium. All the time, the sounds of geese in our ears. Cranes and eagles and geese, they're all big birds. But there's an even bigger one in this landscape, and one that so far we've never missed on this autumn tour. The one bird I most wanted to see on my first visit to Berlin was the one I knew I would not. By the 1980s, there were only some 50 great bustards left in Germany, down from the 3,400 tallied just before the outbreak of the Second World War. This species was gone and is still gone entirely from the West, and it held on in just a narrow strip of agricultural habitat between Magdeburg, close to the border, and Berlin. Even there, the bustard was a bird of mystery. I knew no one who had seen them, and I certainly never expected that I would. German reunification didn't help the bustard. New agricultural methods, taller transmission lines, new roads, more traffic disturbed the birds and fragmented their habitats. and habitat fragmentation is a big problem for a bird that feeds and migrates on foot. The matter became acute when a new railroad line from Hanover in the west to Berlin in the east was proposed. The only problem was the bustards. The tracks would pass right through the breeding and wintering areas of more than half of Germany's tiny great bustard population. There was no way to hope that these big, stolid birds could avoid a train moving at 185 miles an hour. The prospect of bustards lying dead between the rails was a public relations disaster. Rerouting the line or building a 4-mile tunnel through the flock's breeding area was prohibitively expensive, and the compromise was to construct a system of steep embankments on the most sensitive stretches. The idea is that the bustards are reluctant to climb the slopes, but when they do, if they're driven by hunger or by hormones, they can fly from one side to the other safely above the tracks and the trains. Simultaneously, the Eastern European countryside was seeing an increase in non-native predators, such as raccoons and raccoon dogs. 3 feet tall with 7 feet of wingspan and weighing 40 pounds, adult bustards have very little to fear. The chicks are more vulnerable, though. Foxes and ravens had always preyed on the newly hatched young, but when you added pressure from introduced predators, and when each individual chick accounts for a significant percentage of the country's entire population, drastic measures were called for. For the past 3 decades, the ornithological field station at Buckow has gathered clutches of bustard eggs exposed by agricultural activities such as springtime haying. Those eggs would otherwise be lost to predators or weather. Fortunately, the female bustard lays a second clutch. The eggs taken to the scientific station are then incubated and hatched, and the chicks are released onto grasslands protected by predator-proof fencing. Once the young have fledged, the gates are left open, and they can come and go until they rejoin the flock that contains their parents. The strategy has worked, and Germany's great bustard population now exceeds 300 individuals. This project and its success are a source of great pride for many communities in the former East Germany. Not all of them, however, know exactly what a great bustard is. Our own search for this species on the wide open fields is one of the most exciting days of the tour. Finding bustards is rarely easy, but we have yet to miss this species. The trick in autumn is to look for rape fields. The bustards are often conspicuous in the low, flat seedlings, and there's usually no problem in pausing on the roadside to admire them. Spring, though, is a different matter. The displaying males, like great cumulus clouds fallen to earth, are easier to locate, but they're often much farther from the roadside or the observation platform. And in spring, we make a point of leaving as soon as there's any sign that the birds have seen us. These bustards are year-round residents now here in Northeast Germany, but early fall is the peak migration season for another bird. This is crane season, and a centerpiece of this autumn tour is the huge and increasing concentration of feeding and roosting cranes just to the east of Berlin. As a Nebraska boy, I've seen a crane or two in my time, and it might be tempting to dismiss the annual gatherings of Eurasian common cranes as a drop in the great Druid bucket. But 70,000, just 70,000, handsome gray and black birds feeding on agricultural fields, amassing at the evening roosts, or soaring high on a bright autumn day is a sight worth seeing and a sound worth hearing. Crane tourism is becoming significant in some of Brandenburg's villages, and newly installed screens and blinds often let us get very close to the birds as they glean waste grain or hunt small animals on the fields. It's a terrifically moving experience, no matter how many times you're fortunate enough to witness this. We see cranes nearly every day, but we devote our last afternoon together to visiting the famous ponds of Lemn, near the biggest roost of the species in Germany. Lemn is a delightful village in Brandenburg, north and a bit east of Berlin. This was one of the earliest true bird-watching destinations in Germany. For many decades, this town has celebrated the remarkable concentration of nesting white storks. It even changes its name for the months when the storks are present to Storchendorf, Storkville. Houses, barns, and of course this handsome little Gothic church are topped with the huge nests, and it's nearly impossible not to bump into the adult birds, sometimes feeding in slightly odd places. More recently, Lemn has also recognized the value of crane watching. And my guess is that the village draws more visitors and more revenue in September and early October than in any of the traditional stork months. This is the one place, Lemn, on our entire itinerary where we can expect to run into other birders. The cranes draw most of our attention. How could they not? But Lemn has more to offer. The medieval fish ponds just below town are now a wildlife refuge with blinds and towers and lots of birds. On our fall visit, many of the areas are closed to protect the roosting cranes, but the wide central paths still take us from one pond to the other, where we find a fine variety of ducks. Those ducks often include red-crested pottards. We also find plenty of geese, most of them, as expected, tundra bean geese. The ditches and canals between the ponds are excellent places to look for common kingfishers and migrant chiffchaffs and willow warblers, and this is our best chance at good looks at the furtive little bearded Reedling, to my mind, the most beautiful of all European songbirds. And all of that with the wild trumpeting of the cranes surrounding us. These are just a few of the many highlights on our Birds and Art tour of Berlin and Brandenburg. There's much, much more, from the remnants of the Berlin Wall to gull roosts on the big lakes. Through it all, we concentrate on seeking out the intersections of wildlife, history, and culture. It's an easy enough task in a landscape this old and this rich in natural and artistic treasures. The combination is a hard one to match anywhere else in the world. Add in excellent accommodations, outstandingly good food, and a comfortably relaxed daily schedule, and I think it's obvious why this tour has long been among my many, many favorites. Here are the tour dates. This fall's tour, next fall's tour, unfortunately is already full, happily is already full. It is scheduled again, though, for the same dates in 2026. And to talk to someone in the office about that, you should make contact with Penny Saida in the office. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Rick, for that wonderful presentation. And now I would like to turn to the audience and ask them if they have any questions about this tour. And I would like to kick it off. Rick, could you tell us a little bit about the weather in this area this time of year?
Yeah, this is a wonderful time of year to visit North Germany, Northeast Germany. This is what the Germans call the after summer period. The summer solstice has come and gone, of course, but typically in Eastern Germany, the last week of September, the first week of October are what we would call Indian summer. Sunny, relatively warm, calm days, just beautiful. Now, of course, this is Europe, continental Europe, and so every once in a while we do get some rain or a storm comes in, but I don't believe that on any of the tours that we've conducted that we've had more than one day when the rain has kept us indoors. And when rain keeps you indoors in a city like Berlin, there's a lot to do.
Good, wonderful. The description of this on our site says that it is a relaxed tour. Can you talk a little bit about that and how rigorous are some of the hikes and the walks through the parks?
Yeah, you bet. Hikes is a considerable exaggeration. Relaxed in that our starts every morning are quite late, and that perforce. We're far enough north that the mornings are quite dark, and we don't leave the hotel until 8 o'clock or after on any of our mornings. As I said, we do most of our travel within the city on public transit, so no effort involved at all. Out in the countryside, we have our bus and our driver, and we do some roadside birding out in the countryside. We walk half a mile, 3/4 of a mile on good, broad paved paths in the countryside and in the city. In fact, the walking tends to be more strenuous in the city than out of the city, simply because this is Europe and there's more staircases and more curbs than there are in American cities of the same size. but no one has ever had any problem. We're birders. We like to look at buildings and things as we go past. And so our pace is always quite easy, quite relaxed. And as I mentioned, because we are just in one hotel in the middle of a really captivating city, it's very easy at breakfast or at dinner the evening before just to say, I'm taking the morning because I want to go visit a place I saw yesterday, catch you a lunch.
That sounds great. That sounds wonderful. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience, but if anybody thinks of anything that they would like to ask us, feel free to email me, ben@ventbird.com, or Penny in the office, penny@ventbird.com, for any questions about registration for the upcoming tours. Oh, wait, it looks like there is a question that's come in.
Oh, very good.
D says, "Thank you, Rick. We always learn so much from you, and the photographs here make us hopeful that we can join you in the future.
I
Best to
think I
you
know
and
this
Allison."
D. Yeah, very good to hear from you. I hope you're both doing well, do you now?
Well, great.
Yeah,
Well, I
I
want to
really
thank
hope you
you.
can join me. We've had such good times in France together. I think you'll really enjoy this tour too.
Wonderful. Well, Rick, I want to thank you again for your wonderful presentation and your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody coming and look forward to seeing lots of you in Berlin one of these next falls.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.